Welcome back. I hope everybody enjoyed the show, and it brings us to the conclusion of our film, A Nation Divided. It is now my pleasure to welcome the stars of the film, Drs. Silvana Sadali and Jay Sexton. Silvana, Jay, ready to go? Let me just give you a little bit more formal introduction. I know you got their titles, but just let me explain a little bit more. They're close colleagues of mine, but Silvana received her PhD in history from Harvard University in 1999 and went directly to teach at Illinois State University through 2003. And now she's a professor of history at St. Louis University. She teaches courses in the Civil War and Reconstruction, constitutional history, of course, and the history of the Old Northwest. Jay is the inaugural Kinder Institute Chair in Constitutional Democracy and Professor of History at the University of Missouri. I do have to add that he is a native of Salina, Kansas, so we Missourians have to forgive him. It's okay, because he returned to the Midwest to the University of Missouri in 2016 after about 2 decades of studies at Oxford University in England. His specialty is political and economic history of the 19th century. So you can say both of these are well qualified to produce a video like this. For my part, my PhD is in history from Mississippi State University, same time Silvana earned hers. I spent most of my career directing regional historic preservation and public history projects from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. But I was also a history professor at the University of West Florida from 2005 to 2015, when I returned home to accept this position. My research interests include the early Republic and Jacksonian eras, Southern borderlands, U.S. constitutional history, antebellum political economy, and of course, historic preservation and public history. So we're going to start off because being a panelist, I'm not qualified to be also a host at the same time with all these questions. So this will really be Silvana and Jay's show. They're far more intelligent at this than I am. But we'll start off with one of the questions that I knew we'd get. And this question is what actions in the decade of the 1850s would have decreased polarization? Was there any way to prevent the Civil War, or was it indeed inevitable? The question historians hate, inevitability. Jay, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, so you can hear me? All's good with the tech? Okay, so, that, as Steve just said, that is an old chestnut. I mean, a classic exam question for students that they hate. Was it an irrepressible conflict? Could Civil War have been avoided? I suppose the first thing I would say in response to that is that it wasn't as if they didn't try. It wasn't as if they didn't try. And as that documentary just showed, through the escalation of the sectional conflict, really from the Mexican War onwards, you have a number of different sincere attempts to avoid the calamity that unfolds. So in that sense, part of me wants to say that maybe there wasn't an escape hatch, given the sort of dynamics that we discussed in that video about the radicalization of the conflict, particularly, I suppose, particularly in the South. And the real story is how the Southern slaveholders, what they demand in, say, 1840 is very different from what they're demanding on the eve of the Civil War. So in the way I would answer that question is to look at the South. Why does it become so radical? Why wouldn't the Southerners accept some kind of an offer? Don't forget, last thing I'll say here and to hand it over to Silvana, is that Abraham Lincoln, when he's coming in as president, he's willing to support a 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This is the 13th Amendment that doesn't actually become the real 13th Amendment, which is the amendment which ends slavery. The 13th Amendment at that time, which he's prepared to accept, will guarantee slavery in the states in which it exists. And it goes one step further, it'd be unamendable as well. An unamendable amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing slavery where it exists. Why does the South not want this? Well, because emancipation could still unfold at the state level, within state politics, as it had in the North. So I think that the onus of that question is really on the South, and we have to look at the South in particular. But Silvana might have a different take on that.
Well, you just stated it all so eloquently and brilliantly. I don't have that much to add, except that there was a prior generation that tried, as Jay said again and again, tried desperately to conciliate, to appease, to negotiate, to find compromise after compromise. And each compromise just made people angrier. You know, I don't remember who it was who said that the hallmark of a good compromise is that it leaves everybody mad. And I believe that's true. But in this case, the compromises contained increasingly harsh or increasingly difficult to implement provisions, like the Fugitive Slave Law after the Compromise of 1850, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act that destroyed the Whig Party and pretty much created the new Republican Party. So that's one thing. The compromises were increasingly desperate and increasingly frantic and increasingly unworkable. And the other thing is that the old compromising generation died. John C. Calhoun died in 1850. Henry Clay died, I think, in 1852. Stephen A. Douglas at this point had pretty much given up on ever finding what he believed was a moral or ethical solution to the problem of the extension of slavery, by just saying, all right, whatever you want, popular sovereignty. And that's where I believe, you know, was there a moral solution, a moral compromise with slavery? I don't think so. So it's probably a question that can't be answered, because our Constitution protects private property ownership in the Fifth Amendment. You can't just take private property without due process of law. And until Americans were willing to accept the idea that human beings can't be held as property, not decently, not morally, until that happened, there wasn't going to be any solution. And could it have happened without bloodshed? I don't know. That's a question that I don't let my students ask questions like that, really, because it's better for them to learn the facts rather than to engage in counterfactuals and hypothetical questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do believe that it was irrepressible, as William Henry Seward says in 1858.
And just to jump in, if I saw the question right in the chat, it was about other countries, and was there like an alternative path that one sees? And of course, you could say here that the example of emancipation within the British possessions in the Caribbean, the British West Indies, okay, so places like Jamaica, which of course these were profound slave societies and economies built on slave labor. But yet the British emancipated in the 1830s without bloodshed. And so students often ask about that. Of course, what I would say is it's a completely different context or scenario, because the slaveholding planter elite in Jamaica is, of course, profoundly integrated into the politics of the British Empire. But they're not at the helm. They don't control the state the way that the slaveholding elite in the United States does. So I think that American slaveholding and the path toward emancipation looks rather different, simply because of how powerful the slaveholders were within the context of the political institutions and indeed the cultural and economic institutions of the United States.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The one last thing I'll add to that is that Parliament could pass laws that directly affected people's property rights. And yes, there were bitter fights in Parliament about the emancipation of slaves. But the way the British Constitution is constructed, it leaves more room for Parliament to legislate questions like that. That's something that Congress could not have done constitutionally. In fact, during Reconstruction, as you know, the Constitution had to be revised from the ground up to completely change the relationship between the states and the federal government. And until that happened, it was going to be very difficult for Congress to pass laws on those subjects.
All right, I'm going to break in here with, I'm going to do this quickly. We got so many questions and they're so good. Okay. I'm going to keep to the ones at about the 1850s right now, but I'm going to break off a little bit from that. Then I got one for Jay with religion, since you brought up denominations, and Silvana about the Constitution you had mentioned. But somebody had asked, what would compromise have looked like? Jay kind of mentioned the 13th Amendment, and there were attempts to compromise, the Washington Conference, things of that nature before, even after, I think, Sumter, during that fateful summer, then Lincoln sends in troops and the other 4 states leave. But let's look at it this way. We've talked about the moral components that drove a wedge between North and South. And we start to really see that Southern, or the slavery apologists, those who believe it's a positive good for now, and that came out of the Missouri Compromise, but it's full-fledged by 1850s. Mm-hmm. Let's look at it from an economic perspective, because an individual asked, had we compromised, might we still have slavery today? And I know, Jay, you specialize in economic, I do as well. And I remember in graduate school in Mississippi, firing off that it had never survived, even if they had peacefully, just economically, the moral element aside, economically, it would have died. And I had some people say, no. Some grad students of mine in Mississippi said, if there was not any forced amendment, there might be pockets in the Deep South that would still have slavery today. I was appalled coming from Missouri, but I don't know. What do you think about it? Explain the economic aspect of it.
Well, I mean, it is a good question. And I mean, I think the first thing is, you might want to ring fence this a little bit, because when you get into deep into the 20th century, I think the world economy is so different. But was slavery on its last sort of legs? Was it about to die a natural death? I mean, that's the old line. I mean, I think that actually slavery was more dynamic as an economic institution than we'd often thought. Slavery was adaptable. Slavery could thrive in urban areas. Slave labor was important to the building of infrastructure. One thinks of railroads and canals. Slavery in mining in the American West. There's a whole lot of ways in which we have examples of how the idea of slave labor in the United States, simply as the cotton plantations, that's not the whole story. And even if it is, we of course have the example of, after the Civil War, in the days of Reconstruction, the emergence of new labor regimes like sharecropping, which share fundamental features of slave labor. It's a free labor system, but the laborers themselves are tied to the land, aren't they? They don't have freedom of mobility in the way that we think of as ultimate free labor today. So I guess what I'm trying to spit out is, I can't answer how long it would have lasted, but I don't buy into the theory that slavery was about to die off naturally. I think that the preponderance of the evidence points to a dynamic institution integrated into a capitalistic, globalizing economy that could change with its needs.
Is it okay if I add something to that?
Please, yeah, please do.
There's a historian, an economic historian named Gavin Wright, who shows through census materials and economic data that, in fact, slavery was wildly profitable by 1860. In 1860, the single most conservative investment you could make was the price of a human being. It was the cotton and textile boom by that point had reached, was powering a lot of fortunes on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's really why slavery gets so many defenders as you get toward 1860. In the 1850s, in 1857, speaking of the 1850s, you may know, I'm sure you all know, that there was a massive depression, an economic downturn, a panic so severe that a lot of people lost their homes and their farms and their factories in the North. The Southern economy wasn't strongly affected. And that's where a South Carolina senator can get up in Congress and declare cotton king. So, and the other thing to think about is the fact that slavery survived very, very well. I mean, in Brazil until the late 1890s. And one could say that, I mean, there are still people who are not free today in the world. Um,
Yeah.
I always imagine, though, is that perhaps slavery would not have survived in its 1850s incarnation, but some form of apartheid would have. It would not have been a healthy society or a healthy system, that's for sure.
Vaughn, you've got great constitutional history. Talk about the abolitionists here. They obviously thought that one of the questions is that a flawed constitution. What did they see in it that was flawed, and how might that change it?
Well, you know, William Lloyd Garrison calls it a covenant with hell and a contract with death. Is that am I quoting him correctly? People saw in the Constitution, because the Constitution is flexible, because it's a document that is a living document, people sometimes see in it what they want to see in it. Slave owners believed, and probably more rightly so, that the Constitution did protect property and human beings, where abolitionists said, until the Constitution harmonizes with the Declaration of Independence, it is a deeply flawed document. Historian Barbara Jean Fields calls slavery the poison seed in the heart of the Constitution, in the heart of the country. And it had to, that the evil flower that it created had to be rooted out. I don't know if I just answered your question.
I'm going to give Jay a shot here too. I always bring up, just go back to the Missouri Compromise, the issue of the 3/5 clause. And, you know, this elevated power of, you know, the South by that was obviously something. We went to Rufus King and, you know, Talmadge, get rid of that thing, get it out of there. And so that becomes a major issue. Jay, are there any other aspects that you want to pick off that?
Well, I mean, I would just say that, you know, that's absolutely right, that the Constitution on balance protects the interests of American slaveholders, not surprisingly, given the number of delegates in Philadelphia in 1787 who were slaveholders. But on the flip side, we must point out that the Constitution also empowers the anti-slavery movement. It provides certain protections, freedom of speech and so forth, which are going to be central to the anti-slavery campaign. They are operating within this political structural context. They're using the vocabulary in some instances of American nationalism to their advantage. So it's not as if they can't use it as an instrument on their behalf. And I think that the anti-slavery forces absolutely do that. They become ever more adept at doing that as time ticks on.
I always found it interesting too. I always remember when I taught U.S. constitutional history down in Florida, that I would, one of the, you know, pros for slavery expansion into the West, you know, no slavery into the West. It's kind of, I always like that both sides will employ the Fifth Amendment, the very same amendment, to defend their position. The federal government cannot deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. One's looking at liberty, the other one's looking at property. And that just shows you some constitutional breakdown there. It's just a unique situation there. Somebody had asked a little bit more about the Fugitive Slave Act and things of that nature, which I think is one of the most powerful causes of polarization. Somebody had mentioned here, were average Americans polarized during this time period, or was it only the educated political elite? And that's a good question, because if we think about, you know, people going to war, 1 million men and, you know, 400,000 wounded and dead, somehow you're going to get, you know, the common man, if you want to put it that way. And the Fugitive Slave Act was actually one of those issues, I think, that really started polarizing just mainstream Northerners. Does anybody want to speak to that? I'm going to go with Savannah on this one because I got to ask Jay here about religion next. So.
Oh, right. Yeah. And religion is a big part of this. It's an enormous part of this, in fact. The idea of the virtue of the individual. So I don't want to take that question away from Jay, but I hope Jay will talk about the Second Great Awakening and the reform impulse and the fact that slavery was seen as a national sin. it's hugely important. The Fugitive Slave Act, um, this was one of those compromises. It was born out of the Compromise of 1850, and it was one of those compromises that everybody hated. Abraham Lincoln himself and Whigs, people who were at that point, there wasn't a Republican Party yet, they believed the Fugitive Slave Act forced slavery into the North, forced slavery into the free states, because it made it a federal crime to aid in the escape of a slave. And a lot of free states, 8 or 10 of them, passed what are called personal liberty laws that, on the face of them, I'm sorry to say, were unconstitutional laws, but they were moral laws, they were ethical laws that said that when a person enters into a free state, they will automatically be free, and no one is obligated to help that person, to force that person back into slavery. And so the fugitive slave law, as you know, inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write one of the best, probably the first international bestseller after the Bible, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah.
And she based it specifically on this idea that human beings ought to have the right to fight for their freedom, that there ought to be a moral core. The idea behind that book really is about Northern hypocrisy. If you look carefully at the characters she most despises, they're all Northerners. But that's what that book grew out of that. And that book touched people's feelings. It touched their hearts. The idea of Eliza running to freedom across the ice floes on the Ohio River. Queen Victoria, when she got to that point in the book, she wept. So I would say the fugitive slave law touched people personally. And when people's emotions are touched, that is in a way a kind of polarization. They realize that they can't go back anymore. They've reached a point of no return. This can't be compromised away anymore. This is people's lives.
And there's one more point. Sorry, Steve, but
go ahead, go ahead.
The Fugitive Slave Act, I mean, and the polarization, it's not just the Northern whites that now are implicated directly in slavery. It's not just that the Southern slaveholders now have to enter into Northern territory. It's that this provides, it cracks open the window of opportunity for the enslaved peoples themselves. I mean, we must put them at the center of this story of Fugitive Slave Act. Running away, okay, when enslaved peoples run away, when they cross state lines, they know exactly what they're doing. They know that they are pouring fuel onto the fire of this sectional tension. And we know that because we know from court records, from various evidence, that there is a political consciousness, there's a political rationale and calculus to running away. So in that sense, perhaps the greatest legacy of the Fugitive Slave Act is how it provides a political opportunity for those with the least political power of all in mid-19th century America, the enslaved peoples themselves.
Right.
Right. As we mentioned in the beginning, polarization is just not political. It has to have about every facet of society, right down to cultural. Mm-hmm. And that was mentioned in the beginning. And we brought in a cultural aspect. Jay did a magnificent job. Religion, the split in the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, which still exists today. How about the Catholics?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in the story of Catholicism and the papacy in the mid-19th century doesn't follow that same trajectory of the evangelical churches splitting into a north-south wing. I mean, slavery is certainly embedded or part of the internal politics of Catholicism, but it's not a central feature, not least because the center of activity is in Rome. In the mid-19th century, if we have Catholics, as you might well know, that this is a moment of the doctrines of papal infallibility get new lease on life in this period, and there's a new kind of consolidation. You also, of course, have new Irish immigration to the United States in this decade of the 1850s. So while all this debate about slavery is going on, the Catholic population of America increases exponentially. And insofar as that features in or maps onto the sectional crisis, it's not directly that the Catholics are splitting over slavery. It's that the questions about immigration and religion are fracturing the politics of the evangelical United States more generally. So the political institutions, I'm trying to spit out, the political institutions which held the United States together were being pulled apart by the slavery debate, but they were also being fractured by this question of how do you assimilate millions of new Catholics who are entering into America's borders. And this divides the Whig Party in particular, and helps ensure that it is destroyed along with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we got a lot of moving parts there. But I guess the ultimate lesson here is sometimes you have like an X factor, an issue from left field that isn't actually about what the polarization is driving the polarization, but which ultimately contributes to it. I don't know if that helps, Steve, but that would be my line on Catholicism in the mid-19th century.
We'll have to find out from the person that asked the question. So, let's see. How about Dred Scott? Let's throw that one out because we didn't really talk about that, and I didn't add it in any of mine just because I knew that's just a polarizing event. Let's take the northern perspective of the decision in Dred Scott. And Silvana, I'll let you go first. How's that?
Well, you know, he's huge here in St. Louis. I don't know where folks are from who are watching all this. I assume most of them are from Missouri, so you know the story. And I often take my students down to the old courthouse to show them roughly where Dred Scott's first trial happened. It was a case that in the 1840s really showed how the justice system had changed. Originally, Dred Scott sued for his freedom because he had been taken by his owner into a free territory in a free state. And it was based on a law in Missouri, kind of called generally the Freedom Law, that where slaves could sue for their freedom. And about 330 people sued for their freedom under that law and won their freedom. And those are the famous freedom suits that you can all look at and download. They're all online now. And normally, some cases that were almost identical easily won their freedom. Dred Scott did not. I mean, it became a major fight because of the politics had changed so much. The big question is whether Dred Scott was indeed a seriously polarizing event. And historians are divided about that. It wasn't reported that, I mean, the Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's decision that essentially declared that Dred Scott didn't have standing to sue because of the long heritage of slavery. African American people that didn't have standing to sue. What I will say that decision may not have been as well known to ordinary folks, since we're talking about ordinary Americans. It was known to people who were politics, and it enraged people like Lincoln and William Henry Seward and Republicans. By now, the Republican Party, and they're extremely knowledgeable about these things because of course, a lot of them are in Washington as congresspersons. But I do not know, it's not well known how widely that case was actually politicized just in the newspapers. There's not a lot of reference to it in newspaper editorials in the late 1850s.
Jay, you want to add on?
Well, I would say that the key significance here is, that issue about the territories, which was in the documentary about, what's going to be the status of slaveholding in the territories. And you have different compromises. You try to draw a line, you try to do popular sovereignty. But Dred Scott's important because it gets you to where you get in 1860, where it's an all or nothing, where the Republican Party's platform, Abraham Lincoln's platform, is no slavery in any territory at any time. The slave-holding Democrats have completely the opposite. They say they want federal protections. They want a federal slave code in the spirit of the Dred Scott decision, a federal slave code, so that if a slaveholder wants to take his property into any federal territory, he will have federal protection in doing so. So there's no compromise there. You can't compromise between those two positions. And I suppose understanding how we get to that point, the Dred Scott decision, is a really important road marker, one of the most important road markers in that pathway.
I always found it my main area being Jacksonian America, and that's where he got his start. Appointed by Andrew Jackson, late 1835, and the great 1837 term for all the Jacksonian Democrats, the three great cases. But I always, when I taught the course, really the Taney Court in its very first days had four powerful doctrines, and one of them was the political question doctrine. Don't get involved in political questions.
Yeah.
And Luther v. Borden, they learned, no, we're not getting involved with Rhode Islands. That's a political question. And he screwed it up in Dred Scott. If there's anything to insert in that, it was all, politics. So, and I know a lot of the people in Congress, definitely the president, were kind of just hoping that the Supreme Court would resolve the issue. And normally the original Taney Court would have said, this is not a political question for us. It is a political question, but not for us. And he did. He got involved. And I always, as I mentioned in the film, I still think the Abelman v. Booth of 1859 is an overlooked case. Just it's funny because Wisconsin will employ states' rights theories to be anti-slavery. Just shows you how everything can get kind of nuts. So many questions here. So I'm going to build on one that was asked. We all know that there are moral arguments against slavery. That's kind of a no-brainer. Are there moral arguments on its behalf? To the people of the time. Sorry, not right now. Explain what Southerners might have got to. They talked about national security issues, things of that nature. Was there a moral argument that they might have used to say legitimize?
Absolutely. I mean, they absolutely did. I think that's one of the key arcs that one has to understand to understand why Southerners, for instance, will not accept that 13th Amendment, which we mentioned earlier, if it might imperil it. They think it's a positive good. And if you're talking about morality and morals in the 19th century context, you're basically talking about evangelical Christianity. I mean, that would be the prism through which the defenders of slavery would have viewed it. They would have seen it as sanctioned by the Bible. They would have seen it as a benign paternalistic institution which would help uplift the enslaved peoples. This is what they would talk about. And they would have also seen it in moral terms, actually in terms of political economy, that slaveholding was a sort of innovation in the science of labor management and economic production. And don't forget, our Victorians, our 19th century actors think of economics in moral terms, as well as religion. So that would be the arguments that they presented. What's striking is that a Northern audience, and not just your radical abolitionists, not just your John Browns, your average Northern audience over time would start to be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you talking about? And that's why something like when Savannah was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's why it's so important. I mean, this is a cultural sensation. average readers who probably had never thought much about slavery, confronted with its horrors. And of course, Harry Beecher Stowe, presents and writes that book in the language of evangelical Christianity, and presents slavery as an unchristian institution. And that's the key thing. It's not just Stowe. I mean, one more example would be, of course, Frederick Douglass's famous 1845 memoir, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Read at the very end, he's got a little coda about Christianity and slavery, when he points out the hypocrisy of the slaveholders and the way in which they do not live up to their Christian ideals. So the hypocrisy was being called out by the opponents of slavery. Ironically, or tragically, I suppose, that just leads the slaveholders to sort of circle the wagons even more. They still see slavery as a moral positive good at the eve of the Civil War.
I'm going to try to keep here a little bit on the polarization. Let's do this because I'm going to lead you a little beyond it here shortly. But there are some things that we do want to talk about. One of the questions, let's get to Lincoln. I want to turn to Silvana on this one. What were Lincoln's thoughts on the U.S. Constitution?
One of my favorite quotations from Lincoln is, it doesn't have a title. It's called Fragment on the Constitution. And we believe he said it in January 1861. And he's actually, it's one of the very few places where he actually quotes scripture. In Proverbs, a word fitly spoken is, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to quote this exactly right. A word fitly spoken is like an apple of gold in a picture of silver. He thought that the Declaration of Independence was the apple of gold, and the Constitution was the frame of silver around it. So he was deeply knowledgeable about the Constitution. He had been a lawyer for many years before he became a politician. He also believed, though, that the Constitution was a living document and one that ought to change and grow. He was the one who it wasn't customary for him to, sorry, my dog is gnawing on something. It wasn't customary for him to get involved in legislation too much, but he did push through the 13th Amendment that would eradicate slavery because he believed that the Constitution was a living document that ought to grow morally. The amendments shouldn't happen lightly or whimsically, but he believed that to center that apple of gold in the frame of silver would require a constitutional amendment.
So we're going to leave the 1850s here in a minute, but I'm going to, each one of you, give me a little a vignette, something that was not in the video, something that just explains the course of polarization, or, hey, this is what happens, or this is the example of a polarizing event of the day. Jay, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, Silvana mentioned it, so let me drive the point home. And I think this is a really important one for us today. And that is generational change in political leadership. When generations often kind of drop off our radar screen, but I'm coming to the view that generational change matters an awful lot. And if you want to understand why you get that real radicalization of politics in, say, the dozen years after the Mexican War, you can look at the issues that they're debating, you can look at the way they morally frame them, etc. But another way that you might think about it is the cast of characters calling the shots at political positions of authority have shifted. And the old generation, the Daniel Webster's, Henry Clay's, John C. Calhoun's of the world, the old generation who, of course, came of age in the era of the American founding, broadly defined, and the War of 1812 would have been like a real life formative moment for them, fighting against the British, realizing national unity was necessary for the survival of the nation. That was the sort of where they were coming from. And though they had bare knuckle disagreements on policy, they were unionists.
Right.
Very different, very different. You get this new young generation that have come of age. Their political fortunes and political careers are tethered to or linked to bare knuckled, sectional, partisan politics, particularly around the slavery question, but also around some other ones. That's how they practice politics. That's how they get reelected. Okay, and so it's not a surprise that when one generation sort of transitions into this new, more radical generation, that all of a sudden it's not just that compromise becomes more difficult; it's that the political spectrum that needs to be the gap that needs to be bridged has become even wider. And I do think that's an important thing for us today. I think that, you know, you look around, it's the old generation that are trying to talk about unity, at least more or less. There's exceptions to it, of course, but in general terms, but you got these younger generations coming in who've cut their political teeth in this era of bare knuckled cultural warfare. And that makes me really, really, really nervous about the future. And I'm nervous about it because that's what the 1850s actually teaches us.
Ivana, give us a little quip that you might like about that we missed.
It's that older generation had a profound, they had a deep love. They were the first generation that came of age after the ratification of the Constitution. And there was always a real sense that the Constitution and the Union and the democratic experiment were fragile and had to be protected and had to be cherished. That's something you don't see in the younger generation as much. They grew up with it, they were born in it, they grew up with it, and they thought that they could fight to make it what they wanted it to be. The other thing that we shouldn't probably talk about a little bit is the conspiracy theories that were shooting around all over the place.
Yeah.
It's funny, just today in class, I showed my students a newspaper editorial that was published after John Brown's raid. That the entire North was coming to, and that there was this massive slave insurrection just waiting to happen. They really ascribed enormous agency to John Brown that, as you point out in the documentary, he really didn't have. But they absolutely believed it. In the North, there were opposite conspiracy theories. There was a profound belief that there was this thing called the slave power, which, you know, it wasn't realistic. It didn't really exist. But this notion that there were, I mean, the Southern slaveholders were powerful in Congress. Jay is absolutely right about that. And they definitely worked together to create a political climate where they would get what they wanted. But there wasn't a massive, terrifying conspiracy to drive slavery into every corner of the Union. One reason a lot of that happens is because newspapers are super easy to produce now. They're really cheap, where before you would have had to spend quite a bit of your daily salary to get a newspaper, and newspapers would have to be traded around to a lot of people or read aloud in saloons. Now anybody could afford a newspaper. They were maybe a penny a piece. And the Postal Service carried them very quickly and very cheaply. Newspapers had this habit of clipping news from each other. So everybody was hearing everything, and the news could get carried, you know, eventually on telegrams and on trains and steamboats. It was much easier to inflame the popular will this way. And also, one last thing, and then I'll be quiet. Parties bought newspapers. So there was not the slightest effort to be nonpartisan at all. You published your party's point of view. It's kind of funny, those of you who know that St. Louis, the St. Louis, the Democrat was actually a Republican paper because a Republican had bought it, where the Missouri Republican was actually a Democrat paper.
Yeah.
But anyway, I went on too long with that.
No, I was just, one of the fascinating things that to me just wrapped up somewhat of polarization in the 1850s is the case of a single individual. And I always start with my students, or it's that he's a prominent Georgia politician, and I think both of you know who he is right away. He's elected to Congress as a Whig in 1843. Although he did support the annexation of Texas, he opposed the Mexican War. He did support the Compromise of 1850, but he was a key author of what's called the Georgia Platform, which opposed secession. Yeah. By all accounts, he was a moderate, never a radical, fire-eating brand. He was a presidential elector in the 1860 presidential election for Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, who most Southerners constantly classified as the Black Republican. And on the eve of that momentous election, he declared publicly that Lincoln, if he won, would do no harm. And he ardently opposed secession, promoted the Union right up to the secession of his state, Georgia, in 1861. That man was Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the Confederate States of America. And even Jefferson Davis, even though he's a little more radical, could be, it just shows you the power of polarization on folks. Someone did come in with a great question. It's 4 pages long. And I coincidentally, before I got that, wrote down something because I want to take it a little further here, not too much further, because half the questions are about today. So I just want to leave people thinking that's up to you. We're just telling you what happened at one point in history. But usually we know when we cover the period, sectionalism, Civil War, and Reconstruction, if you're teaching that course, we start about 1850. And ended 1877, or at least that's the title of the course. Of course, we have to go back and lead up to it. So we've only covered 1850 to 1860. And as we all know, polarization happened and one side won, right? The North won, slavery ended. We got the 13th Amendment and a 14th and a 15th, the Reconstruction Amendment, Civil Rights Amendments, whatever you want to call them. So Reconstruction apparently is the victorious cap on the Northern victory. Was it? How could you say maybe the South came out ahead? Let's talk about that. Savannah,
okay.
How about you?
I'm sorry.
You want to go ahead? Sure.
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that old saying that the North may have won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction. Partly because in the language and the historical memory of that period, for a long time, I really think until the 1970s or 1980s, there was this belief that somehow Reconstruction was very hard on the South. Although I've always wondered why in a military victory, do the victors pay reparations to the defeated? No, they don't actually. They win. So yeah, for example, that the North should somehow have reimbursed Southerners for their slaves.
Hey, you want to? Sorry, go ahead, keep going.
It was enormously hard on the free people, persons who were liberated from bondage. I mean, I always think that's one of history's most beautiful and most meaningful themes, the liberation from bondage of an enslaved people. But in fact, in the years after Reconstruction, with this new labor system that was just really oppressive and deprived them of even some of their most basic rights, Reconstruction was a failure. And because in 1877, Northern Republicans pretty much abandoned the freed people to their fate in in a compromise that didn't even try to be a moral compromise. That's why we're still living with the aftermath of that. It was never resolved. It was a horrible problem that would have been very painful to resolve, but since that generation punted, we're still dealing with it.
Jay, comments on?
Yeah, I mean the Southern social order is not crushed. It survives to live another day. Indeed, the racial hierarchy becomes more codified, regimented, institutionalized with Jim Crow. Jim Crow comes after the Civil War. It's not something that emerges before. So you could say that in that sense, the Southerners win the war, the Southern white elites. I think there's a lot to that. I'd say two more quick things. The first thing is that violence persists after the Civil War. I mean, one could ask, when does the Civil War actually end? And in that documentary, we were talking about how the Civil War could be seen as something beginning before Fort Sumter. It's certainly political violence persists well after Appomattox. I mean, we're talking decades. We could see something like the emergence of paramilitary groups like the KKK as a continuation of the political violence of the Civil War. We could even see someone like, the James brothers out in this neck of the woods, Jesse James, the last Confederate. To see that not as like senseless violence, but as political violence that's born out of this a crisis of the Union. My final point here, Steve, is who's the biggest loser of the American Civil War? Indigenous peoples, indigenous peoples in the West. The settlement of that question about what's going to be the status of slavery in the West. The North wins, the Yankees win that, and this unleashes a frenetic colonization of the American West. And it's here when you see the intensification of those wars on the plains, wars against Native peoples, against the Sioux Indians in particular. That's the story of the 1870s and 80s and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. That is always, I guess I have a preference for that because that's one of the areas I teach and everything. But we forget the Native American story because they're going to get pounded again. Just Oklahoma, the southeastern tribes moved again, split, and the devastation there, especially among the Cherokees, an example, is powerful. But yeah, slavery may end, but genocide goes on. There is other stories, and there's no doubt about that. But back to kind of slavery's over, but Jim Crow comes in. And I always just remember, I don't know where I read it. It's been a while, but I always just remember, and I don't know if I'm quoting this right, but, enslaved African-Americans were no longer slaves of individuals. They were now slaves to society, with sharecropping, things of that nature and all of that. And as Jay, you mentioned, yeah, here you have knocking on Congress's door again, the same people that, seceded and went to war. So,
including Alexander Stephens himself.
Exactly. Yeah, you bet. So a lot of powerful stories there. We got about 8 minutes. So are there any final thoughts before we close this evening? I'm going to go with Silvana first. Do you want to add anything? There's so many good questions tonight, and I will say this, that over half of them, as you guys can see, because some of these, where are we today compared to the 19th century as to polarization? Because I think everybody who watched this, and I think we did our job, is that, wow, this has a powerful for today, because there's a lot of things that are similar. History's repeating itself. And so if you want to go ahead and say something on that, do it. But I'm one of those historians that, yeah, I can repeat whatever, but sometimes things are different, and, you're trying to compare. Where are we polarized today compared to the 1850s, things of that nature. So you definitely, or are you polarized? If you want to throw that one in. I'm not answering that one because I don't have tenure. So, but any final thoughts here, just for a couple minutes, that you might have that maybe takes us further beyond 1877? So, Silvana.
Oh, thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But there's a saying: history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And we look back on it, and if that's why we teach history. It's why I teach history, is to help young people understand, well, these human beings lived through terrible times, and here's what they tried, here's what they did. And one thing I've noticed, in every generation there are people who rise up and who are really moral leaders, who are ethical leaders, who want what's best for the greatest number, however you define this idea of morality and ethics and principles. And you can always tell who they are. And you can always tell which ones aren't. Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest presidents, in my mind, the greatest president we had. James Buchanan was very well one of the worst. um, so, and it's easy to see why. Great Abraham Lincoln had a great mind and a great heart. So I will say, take the lessons from the past as you can, but you still have to make your own moral decisions. And one thing Abraham Lincoln never did was, he's called right from the very first day that his 1860 campaign launched, he was called Honest Old Abe. That appears on all of his campaign posters and flyers. And whatever else people thought about him, they always trusted him. One thing I find really interesting is looking at newspaper reports in the South after the Civil War about his assassination. And most of them are really grief stricken. It seems almost as though, not all of them, I mean, there were some really hateful ones too, but it seems as though they certainly recognized who he was. So I'll turn it over to Jay here.
Well, I'll pick up on that grief after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, it was one of the first global news stories. The transatlantic telegraph was not operational, but once news reached the center of the global communication system, which was London, it spread around the world like wildfire on new telegraph lines and a new news agency known as Reuters, a new British news agency. And it wasn't but for a couple of weeks before tributes of grief came pouring in from around the world, including some of the most remote areas of the world in the interior of the Eurasian landmass. We have evidence of public meetings of sympathy followed up by letters sent to the United States government. What's my point? My point is that the polarization in the United States in the mid-19th century and the Civil War was a uniquely kind of weirdly American thing. It was about really specific American issues. But its significance, its meaning was not bounded by national borders, by arbitrary lines on a map. The Civil War had international significance. And Lincoln, perhaps more than anyone, recognized this. We ended that video with Silvana quoting his first inaugural address when he calls the American Union the last best hope of Earth. Many of you will have read, of course, the Gettysburg Address, in which he frames the conflict not just about the United States, but about the future of government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? This is about the future of democracy, not just the future of the United States. Americans saw it that way, so did external foreign observers. And I think that's a really important point for our own troubled era. I would say that our troubles here are not confined to the United States, nor are they actually that unique to us. Look around, look at our allies. Look at Great Britain has gone through a very contentious, fractious period over Brexit and so forth. All nations are now joined by the ravages of the coronavirus and the pandemic. The problems of our age, just like the problems of Lincoln's age, are global in nature and therefore, I think, require some kind of global coordination for their solution.
Perfect. And I'm going to leave it with you two here. We're at the close of this session. So many good questions out there. It's easy to get your guys' email address. So if somebody wants a question, we're accessible. Give us questions. That's what we like. But brings us to the end of our time together. And I definitely want to thank you, Jay and Silvana, for joining us tonight. It's always good to see you and share this enlightening information with our fellow Missourians and who may else be watching. I'm going to actually boast something here. And I was just thinking about this. Of the three of us here combined, we have 12 books published. So if the listeners want to read some great books, look at Silvana's and Jay's. I know we have others coming out. I have one in April coming out. So if you go to their websites, and I know I have their books on my shelves all around me. So it's fascinating. But I also want to add too, I always hate doing these hour-long videos because as everybody knows, we talked more in our interviews and our filming than gets on it because you have to cut it down to a certain amount. Well, we decided not to lay that film on the floor, and we created several vignettes, which we're putting on our Missouri Humanities website. And I was going to say stay tuned, but our cinematographer on my staff says they're up there. So if you go to our website and go to the polarizing link, and if it's not up today, wait till at least next week. But I think there's 6, 7, maybe 8, 1 to 3 minute cuts from what we did that you all can go see some more. So just interesting parts and various things we just didn't have time to put in it. So, but I do want to thank again, express our gratitude to the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and especially to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their support and funding in this. And of course, I'm going to thank Ashley for another stellar humanities program. She's the one that should be doing this here. So don't forget to complete the post-event evaluation for tonight's program. And best of all, save the date for Show Me Statesmanship, which is April 29th, which is the third part of this 4-part series. So again, we finish on time, but I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. And this is the Humanities signing off.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. It was wonderful. Thank you.
You guys have been great.
Thank you very much. Cheers, everyone.